I found it most enriching and fruitful to work with the people on the ground. We had wonderful enumerators that were working with us, that we trained, and then they did the household survey. I had the opportunity to be in all 4 places, to be very close to our subject of research, and also to understand and see these difficulties and these challenges that urban areas are facing in these 4 cities and in Africa, maybe in general. That it is not just a question of a current urbanization trend, but that there is a lot of different levels embedded in this complexity of development.
The most interesting find from my project is the claim for land for productive use, more specifically, depends on sociocultural factors that affect the self-determination of complex land market actors. And to the extent where some actors are forbidden from even occupying certain lands for shelter in urban areas. Now, what this really means is that people who are excluded, whether for socioeconomic or cultural reasons from the land market, thus lacking formal ownership of the land they occupy, are unable to use the land in ways that improve their well-being.
An interesting finding that I really observed was that development within the CBD, they're well planned, well developed, with good services attached to them. But as you move away from the CBD, you realize that you find chunks and the houses that are really not serviced very well, that has caused a mix and a complexity around access and usability of these services. And this is where you actually find low-income earners close to the wetlands that are really environmentally sensitive. Yeah.
One of the most interesting things about this project is how difficult it is to operationalize a notion of spatial justice. This has been really surprising for me because spatial justice has always been a concept that I've taken for granted in my work and thought of as something that I've been working towards. And what's become apparent in this project is that spatial justice is far from a universal concept. But once you let go of that notion of universality, it becomes very difficult to work out how to operationalize it and how to use it. And the reason why it's become so difficult to operationalize is because in the context of the 4 cities that we've worked in, Hargeysa, Berbera, Kampala and Arua, it's clear that there are ambiguous outcomes to every transaction and actor. So they can be simultaneously positive and negative. And it seems very difficult then to work with a conventional Eurocentric notion of spatial justice that is figured on segregation or access to resources. So while access to resources and segregation are clearly issues that affect cities, it seems though we're going to need to develop a more nuanced understanding of spatial justice if we are to really intervene in a progressive way in African cities.
So I think the most interesting finding for me was that, all over the world, in cities across the globe, in the distribution of resources is unequal and it's uneven. So that wasn't so much surprising. But the things that shape that inequality are, structural, and they kind of stem from cultural practices and beliefs. So in order to dismantle these kind of inequalities, it's important to tackle these prejudices head on, wherever the city is. I had the privilege of exploring what the impact of clan affiliation is in terms of enabling access to resources within the city. And, it was very eye-opening to see how subtle some of these nuances are and see how they play out in terms of creating barriers to access of resources, to urban resources, be they, say, education, be they infrastructure such as roads, water, electricity, and that kind of coverage of urban infrastructure. So I think the main takeaway for me is, yes, if we are serious about tackling inequality, we do have to interrogate some of our belief systems and cultural practices, and not be shy and not be afraid to offend, even though it is always a little bit politically incorrect. But if we really do want meaningful progress, it's necessary to do so.
The organization around land allocation in Berbera, the power of self-organized groups in Kampala to decide on the fate of land seekers. And in addition to that, the multiplicity of land ownership and the imbalance of information dissemination that reflected the degree of inequalities experienced in these cities were some of the findings that stood out for me.
The most memorable or interesting finding was that despite all the disparities in income, and as a community we all face the same challenges. Whether rich or poor, the roads are bad. Whether rich or poor, access to the water is really terrible. So all those challenges, because of lack of planning, we really need to have those findings. It was very interesting because all of us are affected by poor planning.
When working on the analysis of the household survey in Kampala, what struck me was that 50% of the households that were interviewed had moved house within the last 5 years. As an urban planner, I was familiar with the images of a rapidly expanding city, which is indeed what we found out in the spatial assessment of the 4 cities we did research on. But I had never really thought about the magnitude of movements that were happening to and especially within the city. Imagine you're a planner in Kampala and you want to include people in the planning process, but then 5 years later, half of them have moved to a different place. What do you do? In Hargeysa, we found almost the opposite. 46% of the respondents indicated that they had never moved in their lifetime, which also puzzled me, although in the end, perhaps the translation into Somali might have influenced how people answered this question. Altogether, for me, in order to understand African cities, I think it is important that you understand it in a dynamic way, which includes understanding people's residential mobility. So this has fascinated me to such an extent that it has become the basis of my PhD research.
The most interesting finding that I got in this research is how people who own small pieces of land, the people who cannot have a plot of 50 by 50 feet, how they are willing and how they will be eager to consolidate the land, and they register the land so that they can have land registered in their own names. Just an example, Kampala, many people own land in form of Milo, and the land is for the kingdom, but they don't have ownership for those plots. Most of them keep on subdividing small plots where you cannot even put a structure that is sensible, but people are willing to consolidate and have meaningful plots and title them, and they have land registered in their names. It was very, very, very interesting.
Individuals sell or buy land due to many different reasons. For instance, during my data collection exercise, I interviewed an old sick lady who had sold her land. So I inquired why she had sold the land. She says she was about to die and she never wanted to be buried on land that never had a land title or that wasn't registered. She anticipated after death, her children may sell off the land and the buyer may want them to remove her dead body. So she wanted to buy land that has a land title or that is registered by government, such that even though she dies, no one can unbury her dead body from that land. So for that reason, she decides to sell off her land that she had stayed on for over 50 years.
One of the key findings of this project for me is the the important role that spatial analysis can play in providing important information on cities where data is very, very scarce. For example, in Berbera, all demographic data we found before starting with the spatial analysis provided a range of population between a few thousand people to almost 500,000 people. Through the spatial analysis, we ended up with a more accurate estimate of population, and I think a better understanding of how the city have developed during the last 10, 12 years, which is a really important data in order to understand the city and its land market.
For me, the most interesting finding from the survey is how the urban and the rural or the developing areas mix in terms of land pricing, the housing, service provision, and all these dynamics. This is something that we that is not usually paid attention to, but the survey brought my attention to this very interesting fact.
One of the most interesting findings that I learned during the project has been in the fieldwork in particular way, where I had the opportunity to see, analyze and study the level of exclusion in the city. What I learned is that being a minority clan or a vulnerable group in the city of Hargeysa means being completely neglected by the rest of the social reality, as well as being prevented the accessibility to resources, livelihood, and of course also land security.
One of the most interesting findings from the project for me was that across the 4 cities that we worked, on one level at least, when you talk to individual households, there was this general impression that land markets worked. Everyone was, able to find their level, find land for housing, and so at an individual level, people's needs were satisfied, even if at a sort of wider scale city level, the sort of negative impacts of all of those individual choices was perhaps somewhat unsustainable.
Spatial justice was a central focus of the research right from the beginning, and it provided a really valuable lens through which to consider land markets. But to me, one of the really interesting findings was just how hard it is to pin down and practice. Each of the cities we were working in is undergoing significant change one way or the other. Of course, that leads to significant pressure on land markets in turn, as prices fluctuate and mostly increase, reflecting increasing levels of urban inequality. And in a very real sense, it's then easy enough to isolate examples of spatial injustice. For example, people who have lived in an area for generations who are forced out of the city, or whose lives are changed for the worse in very immediate ways. But as soon as we flip that around and look at what makes for a spatially just city, the question becomes much harder to answer. I found that very interesting.
The most interesting finding for me from the project is that many people are sitting on the land they are illegally. I mean, they don't have land titles for their lands, claiming that they are occupying a customary land, which actually can become dangerous or is risky for them in the near future, especially when development begins to advance.
Yeah, what was my most interesting finding was actually the beauty of using customized platforms. For example, we had the research app that we were using to collect data, and it really gives the sense of security in that it was easy for us to collect the data, and then we had a point of reference whereby we could go and get the data from, and also it was easy to edit add and subtract whatever the respondent is giving you. So it really made the data collection really so easy and really interesting. Yeah.
An interesting finding of the land market assessment is that in both countries, actually, governments and especially local government find it difficult to control the land market and to guide development. This is perhaps not surprising. This is a challenge for cities all over the world. But there are some commonalities between the four cities that we studied. And one is that, first of all, local governments don't have much land themselves. There's not much public land. At the same time, private land transactions are increasing enormously. This is driving up prices and increasing speculation, which makes it even more difficult for local governments to put in a basic infrastructure, to access the land for basic services and proper planning, for example. There's also a problem of land encroachments that local government finds hard to stop. And at least in Uganda, for example, it's not always clear in the land register where the boundaries are between the public land that does exist and customary land, for example.
And the most interesting findings I learned from this field is the fact that most people don't know the importance of having illegal documents and are not really interested in knowing how important it is for one to have a land title or illegal document regarding the plots of land, simply because it takes quite a long time.
Having hard-working and dedicated colleagues and supervisors, and the willingness of respondents to fully participate in the project was the most interesting.
It's interesting to note that there's land fraud, and we need to be so keen in the process of land transaction, especially knowing all types of land and what's required in which kind of land in the process.
The interesting findings to me is one, that rental is an important means of accessing land by the urban poor, since they cannot afford to own land but rather rent, and also the lack of control by state authorities of the urban land markets, and the inability of the public institutions to better guide land markets for public benefit.
The rewards from our side are coming up with real data and evidence of the increasing inequalities that arise from the complex workings of land markets that are shaping the way the cities are developing in sub-Saharan Africa. I'd say that the main drawback of our particular involvement in the research is the fact that we weren't able to engage very much directly in the field, so missed out on that particular experience.
The rest of sub-Saharan African cities, land and property market in general in the four coastal cities are highly gendered. This is mainly because of the existing laws, social-cultural norms, values, and traditions. The situation is changing, albeit slowly. Such a vibrant and highly unregulated property and land markets, there is hardly a single strategy or policy which can turn around the reality so as to restore the missing public link. This suggests the need for selective intervention based on few areas where the weak government or institutions can perform.